Sorry, problems comes with being live. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here today. And to those of us following from home, welcome to a new edition of the cycle What's Going On in the World, which we organize from CIDOB, the Barcelona Center for International Affairs. My name is Oriol Farrés. I'm the coordinator of the annual report at CIDOB. It's a pleasure to greet everyone, as well as thank Casa Asia, old friends and new neighbors, because they very recently moved in here and they collaborate into the organization of this event, which, as you know, has the title Japan and the European Union Global Partners for a Safe and Prosperous Indo-Pacific Region. Whenever we organize an event like this, I'd like to start off by saying that why is it justified for us to do this and about this matter? Well, we have defined about 3 trends which justify us organizing this event. The first thing we identified was the transformation of the world order, which is a transformation which has been taking place for quite some time, which is transforming the world as we know it, at least since the end of World War II, the bipolar world, but basically institutional-wise it was holding strong. There was also the factor of the growing rivalry between international powers and the emergence of China, which is becoming more and more influential around the world, and which is critical in some areas, which for some countries and for some states is perceived as an area of national security. Tied to what we call the international order, what is interesting is that we are headed for a new order, but there's no clear idea on what's it going to be like, or an idea that is at least acceptable for all players, and that generates certain doubts as to where international society is headed. A second dynamic we identified is deglobalization, which is something that started before the pandemic. And basically what they did is proving how easy supply chains were and the dependency we had around the world from products manufactured in China. That took many countries in the world to diversify their supply chains and find alternatives to traditional chains and find a new concept, which we'll be going into deeply today, which is economic security, how to gain resilience within this new context. As I was saying, COVID was key on this point because it accelerated a trend which had been undergoing for a while. Since 2022, yet another accelerator in all this was the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which highlighted a lot of the lines on which this was all happening, the dependence from the European Union on energy. And what it did, it was generate a catharsis among the member states of the EU, which took on a unified stance and strengthened their transatlantic ties with the US. In this context, Japan has held fast by the European Union. They have assisted Ukraine in resources and materials and has also participated in the sanctions regime, which takes us to the third trend we identify, which is a growing interconnection between security in Europe and the security in the Asia-Pacific region. Basically, in the last Japanese summit with the European Union in 2023, it was explicitly announced as such, with a document closing the summit, which said basically the security of Europe and the Indo-Pacific are closely linked. And why do we talk about the Indo-Pacific? Well, I think this is something that bears explaining. We talk about Indo-Pacific because, as any other geographic definition, it has a component behind it on how you interpret the world. It's no neutral definition, such as East Asia was not. What we mean by Indo-Pacific is creating a conceptual framework where the Indian and Pacific Oceans become linked. And thus players in the region may interpret the region or their policies towards the region in a consensual way. And thus explains that India and Japan and Korea look at the Indo-Pacific region with shared interests. And I think that coincides with this point of how to talk about the EU and Japan, because the EU has also appropriated this Indo-Pacific concept and adopted the concept in a perspective. We'll see whether it's precise, but it's similar to the way Japan uses it. Japan expresses it in a document published in 2022, which sort of explains the perspective that Japan has on the region, which is a plan for a free, open Indo-Pacific region. In English, this is known through the FOIP. And this is an official policy from the Japanese government, which is a long-term policy. Japan has been 4 years talking about a free, open Indo-Pacific. True, what Japan has done right now is to suggest, in light of this first dynamic for this international order, what they did was elevate the proposal to the rest of the international order and say, look, we interpret the region in this manner and we propose that the international community to come together under these proposals that we make within the FOIP. And what is Japan suggesting? Well, they highlight principles such as freedom, the rule of law, respect over diversity, inclusivity, or openness. Many of these values and principles match, even in the terms used, with the values that the EU used to define their own strategy for their cooperation strategy for the Indo-Pacific region, which was published in 2021. And basically what they do and prove is that the EU and Japan share many priorities. Not just this terminology as for international order or perspective on international order based in rules, but also priorities as such as the green transition, freedom of movement, human security, or connectivity. These are all shared spaces that we will be exploring through today's session. Recently, this has been enacted 40 years ago, but perhaps it's time to take stock. Japan and the European Union agreed on 2 big pacts, one on economical content and another one with strategic content, and perhaps it's time to take stock on this great agreement between a country and a region in this case, and understand what the potential is, what the issues are, and what these issues are due to. For all of this, which is no small feat, we invited 3 excellent panelists to touch upon from their different areas of expertise, each of these areas. Firstly, there's a diplomacy security aspect. There's another one more about economic security, and another one concerning law, international law, and see how these different areas complement each other to take a general picture of this relationship. Our panelists will be talking for about 20-25 minutes, and we will try to leave 30 minutes so people in the audience can pose their questions and interact with their panelists. I'm sorry to say that we're going to have to be very, very timely when we finish at 8 sharp. And I will appreciate brevity in questions and in answers so we can interact and finish on time. And without further ado, because you're not here to listen to me, I would like to give the floor to the first panelist, Professor Lluc Vidal, who will give us some context into this two-sided dynamic and tell us whether it's true, if it's true that we're coming close to a golden age, if we're close to a paradigm shift, or if that's still a bit too far, if things are still the way they were. I'll briefly introduce Professor Lluc Vidal. He's an associated professor at Open University of Catalonia, where he coordinates the Departments of International Community and Political Science with a focus on East Asia. He's also a lecturing professor at Barcelona Autonomous University with a degree of public administration, and he's a professor at Pompeu Fabra University. He's also a professor in the Master for International Affairs and Diplomacy with the help of the UNO, and he got his PhD on the Japanese strategy in front of the emergence of China. He's also been a visiting professor at Keio University and Kobe University in Japan, and among his most recent publications would highlight Hedging Against China, Japanese Strategy Towards a Rising Power, and Beyond the Gaiatsu Model, Japanese Policy in Asia-Pacific and Neoclassic Realism. Lluc, take it away. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much. Since we are having a bilingual session today, I will be continuing in Spanish. And out of respect for the interpreters, I'll be reading most of my speech today. So I'm going to deal with the 3 matters that Oriol posited. The first one is the international context today, which is quite changing if we compare it to 10 years ago. and what that means for Japan. I'll talk about the relationships between Japan and the EU. And finally, I'll offer some commentary on this notion of Indo-Pacific region and Japan. Just something very brief, because I know we'll deal with it more deeply later. On the international context, right now, well, we have to go back 10 years where, thanks to a scholarship from the Japanese government, the Japan Foundation spent a year in research in the amazing city of Kobe, as Oriol mentioned. And I was researching a matter that is technically tedious, such as the EU and Japan. Not tedious to me, but it seemed like a boring subject matter. And I reached the conclusion, actually, that other researchers reached before me, was that the problem with EU-Japan relationships...
A veces no tener problemas es un problema.
Sometimes not having a problem can be a problem, and that was clearly a case. You cannot reach a more shocking conclusion for a researcher. The fact that there's no puzzle, there's no issue to research. Though I will nuance, with some nuance, I will say that both actors seem to be in great sync in a lot of matters, including security matters, because at least in 2013, these were still two fairly low-profile actors when it came to security. The EU in security matters was not, and is not, more than the sum of its member states. I mean, perhaps now a bit more, but it doesn't have a European army as such, or what it does have is irrelevant if we compare it to other conventional armies. And Japan, whose so-called pacifist constitution, approved in 1946, has an Article 9 which forbids the existence of an armed forces, land, sea, or air. And the right to belligerence is not acknowledged. The Constitution is very clear in that respect. What they do have is self-defense forces, which have been interpreted to not be anti-constitutional, because what they do is to defend the country from any attack around the archipelago. The Nihon no Shugen, so around. That's a very important word, that Shugen. And why is that important to say around the archipelago? Well, 10 years later, the situation has changed, and I am between significantly or dramatically for at least 3 reasons. Number one, Oriol has outlined most of them, but number one, something that I started researching more than 15 years ago, which is the rise of China. And why? Well, because it has an influence in the international system. And let's say that China has already risen. We are not longer talking about the rise of China. China has risen, no doubt about it. I mean, other than if we analyzed the tweets, the trending topic in international relationships 10 years ago was the rise of China. So there was a big interest. Well, this rise is complete. China has risen, and that's impacting each and every exterior policy on the planet, from the US, going to the tiny country of Andorra or the Solomon Islands, and of course neighboring countries such as Japan. How to respond to this rise, whether to do it cooperatively, conflictively, or there's a third way, which I will be referring about today. And so the triangle established by the EU, the US, and Japan, China as a factor is becoming more and more important. Secondly, what have the changes been? As Oriol mentioned, we live on an increasingly, I don't know if apolar or multipolar. We went from, in the 90s, if you remember, or you have researched this, we've gone through the Clinton era unipolar system, just the US, or to a system that is now bipolar, I would say multipolar, with a global south that has more and more to say. And we have seen this on the G20 many times, or on the BRICS. I believe everyone in this room knows who BRICS are. Brazil, Russia, India, The I is very important, China and South Africa. From August this year, the widening of BRICS to include AIE, I don't know how it's going to work, but it's been added with Egypt, Ethiopia, Arab Emirates, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Look at this. Fancy that. Look at all those countries. The emphasis on India from the Indo-Pacific strategy must only help us realize what Japan already noticed in 2007, back when Abe Shinzo was on his first term, that this clash between oceanic plagues was taking place in this part of the country. The axis of financial power was moving from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and specifically the Japanese, they were already saying to the Indian Ocean. Okay, I was talking about changes. Third change, last but not least, the war in Ukraine, which Oriol also mentioned, because it proved the need to apply something which Japan has been talking about since the 90s, which is the Futsu no Kuni, normal country. What does that mean? The normalization of Japanese external politics, which is a concept that expresses the idea that Japan wants to be more proactive. That we're done with that narrative of Japan as an economic giant and a political midget. No, according to their defendants, Japan must go back to being more proactive on the international scenario, despite the existence of a constitution whose Article 9 forbids the existence of armed forces. The Japanese constitution has been changed a total amount of 0 times. It has never been changed. So that's something to keep in mind. Some authors describe Futsu no Kuni with the Anglo-Saxon term salami tactics. I adapted to the Catalan sausage, the FOIP strategy. I don't know if there's any big fans of FOIP, where you start cutting little slices, but then you just keep going because it's so good until the whole thing's gone. So this politological concept of salami tactics, I did not come up with this, but it consists in slicing slowly on this notion of pacifism from the post-war era to make Japan go back to having a traditional army or to be a remilitarized country. Others, and I include myself in those, talk about what I call, but copyright's not mine, making Japan normal again. We know great from the US, but I mean normal. Because according to the strategy Futsu no Kuni, there's the notion that Japan should go back to being a country with offensive forces, they already have that, but who are able to intervene, not just an attack to its defenses, but together with its allies. For instance, the war in Ukraine. Beyond this idea of Nihon no Shugen, around Japan, which has always been geographic, I go to Okinawa if I am attacked, it should be situational. It is understood that I will go wherever I'm needed, be it Ukraine or be it Venezuela. I'm just making up some things here, just to offer support wherever necessary or wherever my allies might have a problem. And the security law fostered by Abe Shinzo in 2014 already allows that. It says from now on, self-defense forces will be able to participate in collective self-defense, meaning military alliances, which is something that in 47 was certainly not interpreted as such. Once you get this legal support, the big question is, I wonder whether Japanese society is ready to see Japanese tanks on Ukrainian land, or even more, in front of an eventual crisis in Taiwan, in a conflict with China. For Prime Minister Kishida, the answer is yes. And he said so a few years ago, Ukraine today, East Asia tomorrow. So Japan being in East Asia, obviously. So this is what Oriol was describing. The second part of my presentation is on the EU-Japan relationships. With this context as a background, we can now move on to the second part. We'll talk about the EU and Japan relations, which for me today, they're everything but boring. I wouldn't say perhaps so much as fun, but there's definitely a very significant change. And I just wanted to talk about two fundamental pillars, financial and security. Number one is the economic pillar. If there's something that's been good and bad in the relation between the EU and Japan, is the financial aspect. From the images we saw in the 80s of the French destroying Japanese televisions in the middle of a full-on commercial war, we've gone to a context of excellent financial relationships between both countries, between the EU and Japan. And according to this synchronicity between both regions, in February 2019 saw the beginning of the biggest financial agreement from the EU, which covers 30% of the world GPD, 40% of global commerce, and in some sectors such as pharmaceutical or aeronautic, almost 70% of the world trade. And even though it's early to take stock of the agreement, if we take into account that the agreement started to being applied during the pandemic, which clearly we can all agree that financially had a great effect on financial calculations. And even though it was the agreement of cheese for cars, which is very simplistic, but basically the idea of like we, or at least France, Spain not so much, will be selling you cheese and you'll be selling us cars, beyond the caricature, the truth is that financial calculations indicate that it's going to have a very positive impact in both economies. A free trade agreement always comes with winners and losers. Let me say that out front. Second pillar is security. Part of the research I carried out in 2013, security relations between both actors were very shy. These are not my words, but it was said back then that the European Union in terms of security, that Japan in terms of security is a midget and the European Union is a worm. Experts were talking about a worm in terms of security. The situation in 2023 has changed. We have gone from constitutional impossibility of developing a more robust relationship between Japan and the EU in security terms, to a situation where even NATO members, most of them European, stated the desire to open up a liaison office for NATO in Tokyo, which has been very well received by Tokyo. So a liaison office for NATO in Tokyo. And what Tokyo understands by this is that this initiative from the EU is a way to involve the EU in the Indo-Pacific region further, especially in the face of a possible conflict with China about Taiwan. For the EU, what it means is a possible growth of NATO towards East Asia. I have to say, as of now, this is only a proposal, and there's actually a country already which has been very vocally against this. And that's not China. Obviously, China wouldn't be happy about the proposal. I wonder if anyone in the room knows what country we're talking about. It's France, actually. France said they don't look kindly on this idea of opening NATO offices in Tokyo because it could bother Beijing. This is Emmanuel Macron was very clear about that. My last remarks gone on the FOIP strategy. Within this new context is when we get this new strategy. Now it's been called Indo-Pacific Vision, Free Open Indo-Pacific, hence FOIP. And let me remind you, this is a proposal from the former Prime Minister and deceased Abe Shinzo to get a new international order based on rules, and it's not said clearly, but it's Western rules, based on the rule of law, which, in my opinion, is a vague, wide-reaching concept, but based on freedom of movement through the, the Japanese archipelago, part of its import-export, use these sea lines of communication. And so, freedom of navigation and free trade, obviously. I believe that during the next remarks, we'll be talking in more detail about what the meaning of this strategy. But I would like to finish on 5 assumptions, which, in my opinion, FOIP means. Number 1, and I said that earlier, but I'll say it again. The realization from Japan for pretty much 15 years ago that the economic center of gravity, as well as political, has moved from the Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific region, and from the north to the south. Japan is very aware of that. The present future will be non-Western, or it shall not be, and Japan is very clear on that. Number 2, China is, as described in journalistic terms, the elephant in the room of FOIP, because on the one hand, there's the Indo-Pacific strategy, and then there's the Belt and Road Initiative, which most of the people present are probably familiar with, and they're presented as 2 competing strategies. On the one hand, one represents Asia oriented towards democracy, liberal and pro-West, and on the other hand, a Sinicized Asia with a strong Chinese leadership, obviously. Point number 3, the great interest for Japan is not just security. It is also, let's not forget it, it's also essentially financial. With an increasingly aging population, and we were talking about this last night over dinner, and with low levels of migrant influx, the Japanese economic growth will not be able to be dependent on internal consumption and will have to depend, like never before, on import, export, and free circulation of all the elements of the supply chain. So this is a strategy to ensure that precisely, to ensure the future of the Japanese economic growth. Number 4, and I'm nearing the end, the development of a regional scheme such as FOIP could help Japan expand their contributions to other countries, their exports to Asia, Middle East, and Africa. And let's think that the strategy goes from Africa to East Asia, especially if the Chinese competitors are excluded from the strategy. And it's precisely the international order based on free trade what is threatened both by China, which is an easy target. It's China, a China that's becoming increasingly assertive and forthright, but with a U.S. administration which also seem ready to defend protectionism. And I'm not just talking about Trump. That's the obvious thing. I also mentioned Biden. And in that sense, this recent change towards protectionism in Washington has taken Washington to espouse on their own regional projects to, in a way, defend this regional order for free trade. The U.S., in some of these projects, aren't really expected to be. And finally, and to me, that's what's most important. It's part of my thesis, actually, but my final remark is that this FOIP, in my opinion, I interpret it as a hedge. Hedge is a concept that might be a bit hard to translate, but it comes from economy, the hedge funds. You've probably heard about those. And it means to diversify risks, not putting all your eggs in the same basket. It's a strategy to not place your bets on one thing straight out, to do things a bit more indirectly. And with my colleague Andres Pellegrini, we say, wait, expect the best, but prepare for the worst. So the FOIP is a natural hedge, both against Beijing, obviously, but also a protection against risks stemming from the not-so-remote possibility of a US deployment. I'm not talking full-on, it could be, but at least gradual, of Washington in East Asia. Japan, in front of this possibility, must stop and think. And this FOIP, even if it's not stated as such in the texts, for me, it's a hedge of Japan in front of the situation. I'm going to leave it here because we have so much else to talk about. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you, Lluc. I don't know if what your words are meant to be quiet. If not having problems is in itself a problem, we need to give it some thought. But I think you're living in a really good point. From the next remarks from Professor Mariko Togashi, which perhaps will go into this economic dimension of this FOIP. Mariko Togashi is a researcher for defense and security in Japan at the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London, where she also contributes to the publication, which you've probably all read at least once, The Military Balance. And she's also a frequent collaborator on a podcast, which I recommend to you all, Japan Memo, which I think helps give some context into these dynamics and discussions that we're having. Before she joined the IISS, Professor Togashi worked as an associated researcher at the API Matsumoto Samata on the Asia-Pacific Initiative, which is today the International House of Japan, where she launched and directed the National Financial and Security Strategy Project. She's also been an analyst in the Asia Group and stock analyst at the Merrill Lynch Bank of America and Deutsche Bank. She also worked as a research assistant in Edwin O. Reischauer for East Asian Studies in Harvard University and in the CIISS economics program in Washington. Take it away.
Very much the CIDOB team for organizing this fantastic event. So today I'd like to cover 4 main points in my presentation to grasp what Japan is doing now in the economic security field and the role of Japan-EU cooperation. First, I will summarize the recent developments of Japan's economic security policy making. And second, I will touch on a broader vision, free and open Indo-Pacific, in detail. And third, I will discuss a few observations of the recent developments. And finally, I will conclude with the role of Japan-EU cooperation. So to react to the strategic changes that Oriol and Professor Vidal mentioned in the region, and mainly driven by China's more assertive actions and also the increased use of China's economic tools for strategic purpose, Japan has been bolstering its effort in economic security policy making in the past few years. In 2020, Tokyo added the Economic Division to the National Security Secretariat. In 2021, the Kishida administration created the first ever economic security ministerial position. And last year, Tokyo passed the Economic Security Promotion Act to improve strategic autonomy and indispensability and to maintain and strengthen international order. The Act has 4 pillars of strengthening supply chains, security of core infrastructure, promoting public-private cooperation and advanced technology, and patent non-disclosure system. And last December, Japan launched its revised national security strategy, which officially defined the term economic security for the first time as to ensure Japan's national interests, such as peace, security, and economic prosperity, by carrying out economic measures. The strategy has a dedicated section for economic security, laying out the concrete agenda, but it also has the value that evaluated the concept of economic security to the national security level. And the implementation of the Economic Security Promotion Act is currently underway. And another set of legislation in this field has been discussed, including the security clearance system. So in addition to institutional changes and the Economic Security Promotion Act, Tokyo strengthened export controls and investment screening through revising the Foreign Exchange and Foreign Trade Act. So domestically, Japan's economic security policy is a combination of the existing and the new legal frameworks. Japan is also leading the international cooperation in economic security. On the multilateral front, you probably remember, but this May in the G7 Hiroshima summit, the first ever G7 statement on economic security was announced under Japan's presidency. The notable steps were to, of course, to recognize and prioritize the issue jointly and to establish the coordination platform on economic coercion. And Japan is currently finalizing an economic security guideline towards the end of this year, which will include responses to economic coercion. There is also Quad, as in of Japan, the US, India, and Australia, as an important platform for economic security cooperation. Japan's former Secretary General of the National Security Secretariat, Shigeru Kitamura, said that Quad is primarily about economic security. I know people might have different opinion, but arguing that strengthening economic security by expanding the democratic sphere by teaming with allies and partners is one of the pillars of Biden's strategy. Under Quad, on top of the working group on critical and emerging technology since 2021, which is central to economic security, the 4 countries recently agreed to launch the Quad Investment Network, which is a public-private body to promote joint investments in semiconductors and critical minerals. There was also a joint declaration by 6 countries, Japan, US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, against economic coercion and non-market policies in practice this June. Another framework to mention is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity led by the US, and the recent development was the launch of a crisis response network to give early warnings of potential supply chain disruptions. And of course, there are many bilateral economic security cooperation underway. Just to name a few, of course, US-Japan started the Economic 2+2 in JUSIP, which is Japan-US Commercial and Industrial Partnership. And the 2 countries have advanced cooperation in areas such as the semiconductor field, especially the development of cutting-edge 2-nanometer chips. UK-Japan has great momentum currently on top of market access with high standards through a CPTPP and SEPA in the Hiroshima Accord. And the 2 countries launched the Economic Security Dialogue for Supply Chain Resilience, Forced Technology Transfers, IP Theft, and Export Controls. The document also included the Semiconductor Partnership and Critical Minerals Cooperation. And this month, when Japan's Economic Minister Nishimura Yasutoshi came to the UK, the 2 countries launched the Ministerial Dialogue between METI and DBT. And of course, please don't worry, there is EU-Japan cooperation, also gaining momentum with substance. I will discuss this more later, but this June, in the high-level economic dialogue, Japan and the EU discussed economic security issues, such as response to economic coercion, non-market policies and actions, resilient supply chains, export controls, and investment screenings. And in July, the 2 parties announced the joint statement, which had an economic security section specifically. The document included resilient trade and investment relations, business cooperation, resilient supply chain to de-risk and diversify, semiconductor cooperation, including an early warning mechanism for the supply chain, and submarine cable cooperation, and coordination in non-market practices as well. So, and also, another noteworthy development was the US-Japan ROK Trilateral Summit at Camp David in this economic security front. The 3 countries agreed to cooperate on the issue and launched the Trilateral Economic Security Dialogue for Supply Chain and Technology Cooperation. So, there are a lot of domestic, bilateral, multilateral initiatives, but behind economic security policy is Japan's broader vision, a free and open Indo-Pacific, FOIP, which is the second point I'd like to make today. So Japan officially, so I'd like to dive into the FOIP concept a little bit more. So Japan officially launched the concept in 2016 at the 6th Tokyo International Conference on African Development. But its origin goes back to the confluence of the two C's speech during Abe's first term in 2007, in India. And then Prime Minister Abe highlighted the dynamic coupling as seas of freedom and prosperity of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The FOIP strategy is about preserving the rules-based order, as Professor Vidal explained, and protecting the interests of all countries in the Indo-Pacific region, including China. And FOIP is often seen as a concept to counter China, but the concept is actually inclusive, which leaves the door open to every country. And this reflects Japan's aim to bind China into the rules-based status quo. In other words, FOIP is to preserve the existing order for peace and prosperity, but also to accommodate the change at the same time, not necessarily through confrontation. The three initial pillars of FOIP were: 1, promotion and establishment of fundamental values such as rule of law and freedom of navigation, and 2, pursuit of economic prosperity through improved connectivity, and 3, commitment for peace and stability through capacity building on maritime law enforcement. Since the launch of FOIP, the concept is developing today to a broader and deeper concept. In June 2022, in the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore that IISS hosts every year, in his keynote speech, Prime Minister Kishida announced the Kishida Vision for Peace, which had the development of FOIP as the very first pillar. And this March in India, again, Prime Minister Kishida made a speech calling for the need to expand the concept of FOIP. Prime Minister Kishida argued that in this transition period of complex cooperation and fragmentation, the world lacks the international order that is acceptable to everyone. He continued by saying that FOIP is a vision of increasing relevance in this sense. And FOIP is to, I quote, enhance the connectivity of the Indo-Pacific region, foster the region into a place that values freedom, the rule of law, free from force or coercion, and make it prosperous. The speech emphasized that FOIP does not exclude anyone, does not create camps, and does not impose values. The government has introduced the 4 new pillars of FOIP, which are: 1, principles for peace and rules for prosperity, which include fair trade rules and infrastructure investment and financing. 2, addressing challenges around global commons in an Indo-Pacific way. 3, multi-layered connectivity, including physical, knowledge, and digital connectivity. And 4, adding the air domain to efforts to maritime security. And Japan announced 51 action plans based on these 4 pillars. These developments show that while the core value of FOIP remains the same, what it includes and what it means has developed to deal with the changing environment. So, now that I covered Japan's domestic and international economic security policy developments and the FOIP vision, please allow me to share 3 of my observations. And the first observation is the relationship between FOIP and economic security policy, which is not necessarily discussed enough, in my opinion. On the surface, these two may look contradicting, as FOIP emphasizes inclusivity, while economic security policy can be seen as China policy. However, if you look into them closely, these two are mutually dependent on each other. In other words, economic security cooperation will require a free and open Indo-Pacific achieved, and achieving the FOIP vision will also require economic security cooperation in the region. Economic resiliency is included in one of the 51 plans for FOIP that I touched on earlier. So evidently, economic security is part of FOIP, but at the same time, for economic security cooperation to deepen, a free and open Indo-Pacific will be a prerequisite, whether it is about supply chain resiliency, fair trade practices, or advanced technology cooperation. The second observation is the Japan's changing role. The spread of FOIP has shown that Japan can play a leading role to maintain the international order in the era of strategic competition. One of the most prominent examples of Japan's initiative as a role maker for economic prosperity is the CPTPP, which was launched in 2018. CPTPP achieved high standards of market liberalization, including digital commerce. And most recently, the UK joined the CPTPP, which shows not only the economic benefits, but also the strategic interest to preserve the rule-based order in the Indo-Pacific are not only limited to the countries in the region. And also another example is the Data Free Flow with Trust, DFFT, which shows Japan's leadership. Japan proposed this concept in 2019 to secure rules for the protection of open cross-border data flows. And this year's statement that I touched on earlier, the G7 Hiroshima Summit Economic Security Statement, was also one of the big achievements led by Japan. All the diplomatic and economic endowment that Japan has, FOIP, the ability to coordinate with the West, pioneering economic security policy making, and the long history and big exposure to China enabled Japan to play a key role in pushing economic security cooperation forward. The final observation is the challenges ahead in economic security cooperation. Economic security policy has a lot of elements, such as security policy element, trade policy element, tech policy element, industrial policy, so and so. Therefore, inevitably, putting economic security on the international agenda brings both cooperative but also competitive elements. And of course, there are many challenges in economic security field, such as regulatory coordination, keeping the momentum among the G7 countries, prioritization, etc. But I think to manage the competition among partners and allies will be the key challenge ahead in economic security cooperation. For instance, the US export controls on October 7 has shown how coordination is not so easy even among partners and allies. This is because economic security decisions directly affect the market share of specific field or company. And in other words, economic security is the area the security interest and economic interest may conflict. This implies economic security will require careful coordination among countries and within countries between the public and private sectors. And I think Japan and the EU can play a key role in managing the competition, which leads to my final point, Japan-EU economic security cooperation. The EU-Japan economic relationship has been strong, and not just trade, but also establishing the Green Alliance and digital partnership. But as I discussed at the beginning, this relationship has been upgraded and the economic security cooperation is accelerating. Both the high-level economic dialogue and the joint statement both show economic security as key agenda. And I argue that Japan-EU cooperation is vital to achieve the free and open Indo-Pacific. The two parties have the strategic interest in working together, and there are several reasons for this, but one of the biggest reasons is the strategic interdependence of the Indo-Pacific in Europe. And as Professor Vidal mentioned, as Prime Minister Kishida said in last year's, again, Shangri-La Dialogue, that Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow. And another reason, of course, is the both parties committed to rules-based order, and this will benefit, this benefit spreads to many other countries as well. And also, rule-making is also a priority, and which both parties have the capacity to do so as well. And finally, the close relationship with the US is also the reason why EU-Japan cooperation and economic security makes sense. While the US is an important ally for both Japan and the EU, this does not eliminate the fact that all three can be competitive in certain areas. Therefore, especially in a time like now when the US-China relationship is contentious and vulnerable, Japan and the EU has even bigger potential to lead the rules-based economic security cooperation. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Perfecto. Muchísimas gracias. Creo que los comentarios al Shangri-La Dialogue son plenamente justificados porque como
I believe the constant allusions to the Shangri-La dialogues are completely justified because there's no forum that joins all the European countries, but there's this informal meeting which is attended by many leaders in all these countries, and where everyone pays close attention to synergies and attitudes. And so it's the moment to launch many of these strategies. So I think it's fully justified. I won't dilly-dally. We've talked about security and economics. Let's now talk about law with Professor Carmen Tirado. I'll introduce her briefly. Carmen Tirado is a professor of international law and director of the Master for Japanese Studies. She's a director at the University of Zaragoza, where she's also the leading researcher on the group of research on Japan. Her research focuses on Japan as a subject of international law and their relations with the EU, with their Asian neighbors, and in particular, its role on the international scene. She's said different times on the European Commission, the European Council, and the Academy for University. Also in Japan, University of Nanzan, Tokyo, Osaka, and Tokyo. Carmen is also the director since its creator in 2022 of the collection of study Japanese from Aranzadi Publishing House. Thank you so much. I'll just take 10 seconds to thank CIDOB and the Japanese consulate that they thought about me to participate in this event. And I will wrap up today's session going back to some ideas that my colleagues have already mentioned. And I would like to focus on international rule-based order and what the contribution of Japan is. At the end of World War II, a new international order is created based on the UN Charter with the idea of protecting international peace and security. International organizations are created, not just the UN, but international associations at the European level, other international institutions such as the current World Bank or the IMF, as well as regional security alliances such as NATO. This international order was based on the UN Charter. I'm just going to look at it from a legal aspect since that is my world of specialty. This international order has gone through different crises, which has been overcoming, and we're now encountering a relatively new concept, because I believe it's towards the end of the 20th century that we start hearing about it. But this rule-based international order has started to become famous, especially since Moscow acknowledges Lugansk and Donetsk as independent republics. Moreover, this is a highly criticized concept, mostly because it has a very direct relationship with a U.S. foreign policy. There's a quote from Lavrov, foreign ministry in Russia, who said, instead of international law, the West started to demand that everyone respected the rule-based world order. These rules represent no one because they simply don't exist. This is what Lavrov was saying back then. He was separating rule-based international orders from international law. In my opinion, he's wrong. I believe that this new international order, true, it is new, and perhaps we need to adapt to a new situation. But the way I see it, the UN Charter is still valid, as are the values and principles that it contemplates. It must observe international law, no matter what Lavrov says. And it's true that there are detractors, Russia, obviously, China, Iran, or North Korea, even within the creators of this international order. And some are critical, for instance, the America First Trump initiative or Brexit itself. Those are critical actions to that international order. What I believe is that the world is changing. Some rules of international law must remain valid. They must remain unchanged, while others can be negotiated. But there's a valid international law, such as forbidding the use of force, Russia notwithstanding. So the core of my remarks is going to be identifying whether Japan is taking part in this new world rule-based order and how they're going about that. And I'll be giving some examples because I don't want to go on too long. And especially because some of the ideas that I have already been mentioned by Lluc and Mariko. First, well, FOIP. FOIP is a primarily Japanese initiative, even though at first it was an Indian Navy captain who sort of made it public and even wrote an article on this. So FOIP, as Shinzo Abe, as it has been said, sort of shyly in 2017, and with more detail in 2016. And this Japanese initiative has been fully embraced by many actors on the international scene. Number one, the US. They don't see eye to eye exactly with Japan, but, and there's also the European Union, but also some of its member states. Organizations like ASEAN. So it has made ripples across the international scene. This is an initiative fostering values that we might consider universal. Rule-based international order is one of the cores of FOIP beyond free trade, freedom of navigation, or rule of law. The Japanese initiative, as I was saying, is a little different from the North American because mostly the one in North America excludes China, whereas the Japanese vision is inclusive. They talk about complying with international law. That's no criticism to China. Some authors think that FOIP is a direct response to China's initiatives, Belt and Road Initiative. But I would say, is that all that FOIP is? I don't think so. It is far more wide-reaching, and I was saying it does not exclude China. Japan thinks it is a country with few natural resources. They don't have an acting capacity in the international scene that the US or China have. And to maintain their current peace and prosperity, maintaining international rule-based order is not one option between a handful. It is a vital necessity. That's why the spine of FOIP is a rule-based international order. There's also, the FOIP introduces the concept of human security, which is born within the UN in their Human Development Report in 1994. But it was strongly supported by Japan as well as Canada. And both options for human security on the table: freedom from fear, meaning defense from individuals to violent situations in violent conflicts. And then there's freedom from want, protecting individuals not just in those situations of armed violence, let's put it that way, but also in situations of inequality, seeking financial security, as Mariko was saying. And also matters of poverty, gender. Well, Japan chooses the second option. They don't offer an exact definition for human security, basically because they prefer not to, because that makes it easier to adopt this concept for human security for a wider reaching spectrum of options. Humans are at the core of this human security concept, which also corresponds with this other Japanese initiatives that put humans in the middle, such as Society 5.0, which tries to put robots and artificial intelligence at the service of human beings. This is another example of how Japan promotes this rule-based international order. A third example is the role of Japan in the signing of international treaties, especially those of a commercial nature. Japan had a very strong leadership role in the TPP-11 negotiation. After the US left, Japan became the leader, but also on the agreement of Regional Integral Economic Association, which has been signed by the members of the ASEAN, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, together with China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. Finally, Japan signed a commercial agreement. To add something to what Lluc said on the matter, to me, it's not just a trade strategy. It's a economic cooperation agreement, which goes well beyond those interests. It also supports the environment, small and mid-sized companies, the ability to which Japanese companies can operate in the EU and vice versa. So it opens a far more wide-reaching possibilities than mere trade cooperation. And obviously, that is also based on rule-based international law. This is specifically mentioned in their articles. The next example that my colleagues have already mentioned, Japan has been heavily criticized, especially from countries in its Asian environment, particularly China, when in 2014, the Japanese cabinet adopted a new interpretation of their Article 9 in their constitution, and in 2015 approved a new bill on security and defense, which modifies not just the Yeitai law, but approves new rules for Japanese international cooperation. And this has been heavily criticized because it's come together logically with an increase in Japan's military capacity, distancing with the US, it's true that criticism comes especially from their Asian neighbors, but from the legal point of view, there could be some nuance to these changes that were made, because they were made without a much necessary debate on the Japanese public opinion. And because Jiminto, the party that has been in the government for most years, ever since the World War II ended, has used their number of seats to pass this bill without a much-needed parliamentary debate. It's such a delicate matter that, in my opinion, and I know I'm not alone in this, required a larger debate on the public opinion and in the parliament. I will be looking closely at two cases which include a heavier or less heavy participation of Japan, just to finish my remarks. I will talk about the arbitrating in the Permanent Court in The Hague in the case of Philippines against China. So the Philippines sued China over the sovereignship of the Spratly Islands and on the building of artificial islands on the China Sea. China did not appear before the court. It did not acknowledge their competence. And so this clearly was not the right legal venue, because ultimately Philippines was found to be in the right. This procedure, Japan was one of the countries intervening, but it wasn't a direct part. So why did Japan intervene, and other countries as well? Because several countries have participated. Well, mostly because control in the Sea of China has been a strategic priority for China ever since they declared that Kaohsiung line, because of the shape that it has. And it establishes a proposal for sovereignship that is extremely wide-reaching, particularly in such a conflictive area. And I'm mentioning this because one of the things it did was interpret Article 121.3 from the Montego Bay Convention on the Laws of the Sea. And what the court resolved is they distinguished between islands and rocks, such as the Montego Bay Convention does, and it puts an end to all doubts and interpretations and analysis that had been given into determining what an island is and what a rock is. So this content despite the fact that Japan advocates for complying with the sentence, it actually harms Japan, which is because Japan has an vested interest in a rather unknown region of the atolls of Okinotorishima, which does not acknowledge, there's not a problem with a sovereignship, but Japan wants to make it into a special economic zone. And according to the Montego Bay Convention, Japan has not a right to establish it. We have to say that Okinotorishima is not an island, it's a bunch of rocks, so Japan does not have the right to contribute it into an exclusive economic zone. And the answer of Japan has been to invest in those islands, building a helipad, a research facility, to fulfill the conditions of Montego Bay Conventions as to what an island should have: a human inhabitants and a financial activity. So Japan is choosing to comply with international rules, even if they harm them. So they're able to sacrifice their own interests to comply with that rule-based international order. Finally, the last example I'm going to give before I reach my conclusions is the case of Australia against Japan on the whale hunting issue. As we know, in 2014, the International Court of Justice sentenced Japan over a specific program of JARPA 2. There was a JARPA 1 in the past, but it's basically to take lethal samples of whales. But the Hague said that JARPA 2 must be eliminated because it does not comply with the Convention on Whale Hunting for that sample taking for research purposes. The court also said that Japan must abstain from handing out any other permit or authorization to whaling companies to take the samples. And how did Japan respond? Well, they accepted the sentence and removed JARPA 2. True, soon after they created a new project with similar characteristics, but Japan's strategy goes well beyond that. What Japan did after that was to modify the clause, a submission to the Hague Court, to avoid that in the future the new program they adopted might be questioned by the court. The participation in international courts is voluntary, and all countries submit to it with specific clauses. And Japan now says that in matters involving the conservation, handling, or exploitation of live sea creatures, the court will no longer have competences. That what this did was Japan would stop being a member of the International Whaling Commission. Japan's position in this has been heavily criticized in the international sea. But from the point of view of international law, the approval of this new program for this sample taking for research purposes is to be criticized. From the point of view of international law, the modification of the submission clause is absolutely flawless, nothing to say there. And stepping away from the International Whaling Company comes also with no issues from a legal perspective. As I was saying, it's true that Japan approving a whole new program is not really consistent. But the thing is, what Japan now means to do, and they're actually succeeding, is to substitute that whale hunting, which also has heavy cultural connotation, with whale watching, with a different financial activity, which does not imply the death of the whales, and which is yet another popular tourist venture. As conclusions, rule-based international order is a rather indeterminate concept. We don't really know. There's no consensus yet onto what concept it should be included. But I'll say my opinion. The UN Charter still stands. The rules for international law are still valid, even though they are sometimes broken. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's in decadence. Japan has carried out proactive actions when it comes to international relations, and it has done so very intensely on rule-based international order, and I mentioned some examples. And as I said, that rule-based international order for Japan is a vital decision. Within the geographic context in which Japan operates, it is necessary to have this rule-based international order. Japan's contribution, we can say, is very positive. Japan is in high compliance and is a positive contribution to this rule-based international order, even though some actions could be open to criticism or nuance. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carmen. Thank you, Lluc and Mariko. We've had the 3 visions that we were looking for. And I would like now to open the floor in case anyone has any questions for the table. Yes, I see a hand over here.
Emilio, mírate también.
Esta pregunta va dirigida sobre todo a la profesora.
This question is meant especially for Professor Togashi. When we think about security in Japan, we first of all think of the alliance with the US. And for a few years, Japanese participation as an AP4 in NATO. Within this context, the EU, with its strategy for the Indo-Pacific region, has tried to position themselves as an actor for security and defense. And we were mentioning whether on this matter it was a worm, but the EU wants, at the very least, to be a midget. So the interest of the European Union to security matters in the Indo-Pacific has gone through number 1, taking place on the different forums for security and defense present in the region, and secondly, through a C1 Crimeria programs. Can you hear me properly? It focuses on 4 key areas: sea security, which has been given a great importance, counterterrorism, cybersecurity, and crisis management. My question is, what is the real value of the EU for Japan in security matters in this context? Do we have any other questions? Shall we get them all at once and then answer to them? Hello, good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank thank you for your remarks. They were really interesting. My question is, given the post-pandemic context and now the crisis in Europe with the Ukraine war, among others, have manifested the global competition over resources. And in the Japanese context, given its economy, over technological resources, rare earths, semiconductors. These resources, in large part, are located in what we know as the Global South, Africa and the Middle East. And also, the European Union has also tried to redefine the relationship with Africa, and Japan, because of its condition as an archipelago, is very vulnerable. And it needs to protect its supply. How does this dependence fit with Africa, with the Indo-Pacific context, given that China and Russia are competitors in Africa? Thank you very much.
Hear me properly? Okay. Thank you so much for all of you and for the very informative presentation. And especially my question goes to Dr. Vidal. Thank you so much for your, you actually touch upon Abe's public diplomacy as well as the current debate ongoing inside and outside of Japan. And my question is especially about NATO liaison office concept. concept that you mentioned in your NATO liaison office in Tokyo concept, that you touch upon during your presentation, and it's because of the French, negative view, especially Macron view. Because of that, the liaison office concept has been postponed. But when it comes to that, new concept of the relationship between, or cooperation between NATO and Japan, as which is standing in the front line in the Indo-Pacific. And as a Japanese researcher for myself, it is we should be very much, we should be pursuing that, the concept will be, make sure that the concept will be, recognized as or addressed properly in the near future, hopefully. And also, you touched upon Shinzo Abe's public diplomacy, and in that sense, I would say in Japan, and in that sense, I would very much, I'm not, for maybe, as you know, Japan, strategic, in terms of strategic communication, is not necessarily, good at doing the, strategic communication, especially, communicating to the NATO as well as EU members, as well as now it's, gradually catching up, like let's say AP4 as well as Quad members. So how do you think the NATO's liaison office should be utilized by, especially by Japan. If you have any ideas or advice for Japanese researchers, Japanese policymakers as well as diplomat, I would be very much appreciated that. And also. For the NATO countries, NATO members, how do you give your opinion or advice to themselves? How can they or should they utilize NATO liaison office in a cooperation along with the let's say NATO members as well as AP4 members? Thank you. Both sides, yes.
Hay una más por aquí, Inés, por favor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much to the three panelists. It was very enriching listening to different perspectives, especially areas that we often don't have access to. I would like to be a little provocative in how we've seen the EU as a completely united actor, especially after the Ukraine war. And my question is, if within the EU we have several members that have different understanding of the Indo-Pacific, for instance, as to the extension of this territory, what countries does it comprehend, what countries does it not comprehend? What does it need, for instance, if it needs sea patrols or not? If there's that internal disagreement within the EU, how does Japan see it? If what Japan sees is a desire to work bilaterally on top of regionally, and what challenges can we work on within the EU to really come up with ways of coordinating the EU to make sure it's not that fragmented, where there are some countries in this region of the world where some countries have more interest or more desire to apply resources than others?
Empezamos con...
Okay, how should we go about this? Perhaps we can start with EU and security. Who wants to go first? Mariko?
Very tough question. Let's take this off. I think the real value for Japan and in the region is to have the united front. The resource-wise, Japan understands of course we understand that there's limitations militarily, economically, but presence is important, and because if you look at the opposite case, the war in Ukraine, Japan had the first fast reaction, and then had the unprecedented level of coordination in terms of sanctions. And of course, in and of itself, to support Ukraine is important, but like I said, the security of Europe and Indo-Pacific is intertwined more than ever. So I think to coordinate at that speed had more value than to support one country. Again, that's also important, but that meant more than that to protect, to defend the rules-based order. But I think there's also, the value part, that my answer is that, but I think there's also very subtle coordination that has to happen for the Western country, for the European countries to be in the region, especially militarily, because there are, as you know, diverse countries in the region, and ASEAN centrality, we've been talking about that for a long time, and I think there should be a very close coordination. But going back to your question, I think the real value is there, and the presence, as you mentioned, is important.
Dependencia energética, hablamos.
Okay, let's leave financial dependence aside. Perhaps the one on the NATO liaison office. Right, but I wanted to reinstate what has been said on energy resources. I think I said it in my remarks that the Indo-Pacific strategy is oriented towards an extension of markets towards the Middle East, Africa. So I come here to sort of support what you said. I already mentioned it in my presentation, but I insist on this English concept of sea lines of communications, which are true sea highways through which there's import, export, and obviously warships also go through. Any interruption to these sea lines of communication in a mega archipelago such as Japan, it's not that it's going to have an effect on its economy, it's going to have effects on its security. And even if it doesn't happen to Japan, if it happens to Indonesia, it affects Japan also almost directly. So that strategy is also conceived with this in mind. On the liaison office, I have many comments on this. I am going to try and be very brief. But in my understanding, and perhaps the diplomatic corps could explain this better, but these liaison offices are less than what has been said that they are. They're offices for collaborations between this case and NATO non-member with the organization to carry out joint activities, very soft to begin with. And I think that is what the liaison office is about today. The interpretation that's being given about it is very different, particularly in a part of the world where any movement from Tokyo in matters of security is often misinterpreted or interpreted, and I'm going to leave this to analysts, by some of its neighboring countries, China in particular, also South Korea. I mean, I'm not even going to go into North Korea. And I believe, I'm not a fan of giving policy recommendations, but my recommendation would be to be very careful about opening this office without a clear goal so it is not misunderstood. Because the security system during the Cold War was called the hub-and-spoke system. So it's a big wheel with its radius and with the US in the middle. And the spokes were a series of military alliances between the US and many countries. It's a bit of an odd-looking wheel because one of the spokes is disproportionately large, which is the agreement between Japan and the US. If you imagine the wheel with spokes, some very thick, it's going to be an odd-looking wheel. That's the basic system. Actually, for many years, it has been researched. There's a very well-known article called Why There Is No NATO in Asia-Pacific, well, Asia, and the conclusion back in the day was it's not that easy for countries with such cultural, financial, and political diversity to come to an agreement. I just summed up, probably really poorly, the article, but this was the gist of it. It was written by an author called Katzenstein, and basically, what the interpretation was the broadening of NATO towards East Asia, which is something at the very least deeply problematic could be. So partly I understand Macron playing France, which is to always criticize, always be angry. France, what do you expect? But I also understand that what he's saying is this needs to be done properly. Otherwise, it's going to be misunderstood, especially by China. And I can understand that. The thing about the Indo-Pacific is, Professor Tirado mentioned it, with human security. I've also spent many years analyzing this concept, and this is not going to sound funny in English, but in political science, it's called OVNI, which in English is UFO, identified political UPO, an identified political artifact, which is something that's devoid of meaning, and we need to give it the meaning, which is still waiting to be built. It's also hedging, a bit ambiguous, to be honest. Professor Tirado will throw the Indo-Pacific question and division within the EU to you. Well, I was trying to draw a parallel between FOIP and that divergence in visions from the different countries and the possibility that this could affect with compliance, with the proper development of the relationships between the EU and Japan. I believe here we're moving across two very different fields, because FOIP is a political, governmental, diplomatical initiative, but not legal. There's no international treatise on FOIP, which establishes that an obligation must or must not be complied with. And there's no such, it's just a political initiative. So there might be some divergent opinions because there's no obligation to comply with anything. True, some agreements might push towards complying with some of the FOIP's ends, but there's no legal obligation. However, the relationships between the EU and Japan, there are two legally binding treatises. There cannot be any differing opinions. The treaties or the agreement for economic cooperation, for trade association, is an agreement that has been passed. It was signed by the Commission in name of all countries, because this is a field where the EU has a competence. So the member states put in the hands of the Commission the decision-making, and the Commission decide to sign. So all 27 member states are forced to comply with the treaties. There can be no dissenting opinions. In the case of the strategic agreement, we still have a provisional application because the agreement contemplates competencies which fall outside of the EU, which are still exclusive to the member states. Because in the cooperation treatise, the strategic agreement looks at 40 specific cooperation matters, and some of them are very delicate. So this agreement needs to be signed both by the European Union as well as every member state separately. And the last time I looked, we have still had 2 or 3 states to sign. When all the states sign, we will then be compelled to comply with the whole strategic cooperation. Right now is only done provisionally. Many articles are being applied, a significant part, but the dissenting opinions for FOIP might be good, but in the relations between Japan and the EU will not. Thank you so much. We are right on time. We don't have time for more. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to the friends who are here today, who took a very long trip. And thank you to all of you for you being here, and to everyone following online. And we invite you to follow us online, both at CIDOB and Casa Asia. Thank you very much.